Greetings, students. Welcome to the sixth module of this course, Technology and Society. This module is titled Digital Public Engagement. And under this module, I'm going to cover two broad aspects that refer to digital public engagement. So the first topic that I will be covering is on fundamental theoretical premises of digital public engagement, where I'm going to walk you through some of the fundamental concepts, some of the fundamental theoretical frameworks that have conventionally been used and are currently being used to understanding digital public engagement. And in this second part of this module, I will be taking up the question of digital data and digital archives. So moving on with the idea of the theoretical premises of digital public engagement, there is this broad area of inquiry of scholarship that looks at the politics of digital watching. And when we talk about digital watching, watching something online, watching something on the internet, having a profile on social media, on a platform, and so on and so forth, we are talking about two fundamental frameworks that guide our actions and repercussions in that respect. So these are surveillance and surveillance. So surveillance, as you know, is being watched from the above. So if there is a surveillance sort of a mechanism in place, that means that somebody is being watched from the top, from the above. And surveillance is just the opposite, that it's a mode of being watched from bottom up. That is, it's a mode of being watched by the public. So surveillance and surveillance have been guiding some of these politics of digital watching, and I will be talking about some of the theorists who have talked about surveillance and surveillance, and what happens, what follows from that discussion is also an understanding of power. And this sense of power is understood, as in digital public engagements on social media platforms, on other platforms where there is, community involvement, public engagement, and so on and so forth. So there is a growing literature on the use of digital social media, and particularly looking at social media platforms. So this scholarship looks at some of the means of facilitating and inciting, for example, digital social activism, or on the open data movement, for example, or fundamentals of surveillance strategies and technologies. So these are examples of the production of the use of digital data for various purposes. And when I say digital data, I will walk you through that concept in the second part of this module. And then coming back to the question of surveillance and surveillance and the politics of digital watching, may I also recall in one of my previous lectures where I was discussing the idea of network society by Manuel Castell. So Castell's network society, as you know, positions networks as the basis of contemporary societies. And these societies are digital societies, as an example. And these contemporary societies bring forth a very niche, a very sort of characteristic feature of structure and power relations. So in the case of new information technology, as you will see in network societies, power then becomes multidimensional. And this power now resides in the networks that we see around us. And these networks can be comprising of global, financial, political, military, security, information production, and multimedia networks. So these networks, what Castells talks about the network society, comprises of a variety of networks, a variety of structures of power relations, and therefore power is triggered in this case as multi-dimensional. It's not unidimensional as has been conventionally understood. And all these networks, the network society, the networks that guide network societies, they are involved in defining the rules, norms, and practices of a given society. So, in other words, these networks are as much contextual, these networks are as much situated within social practices, within social norms, and they influence and are influenced by social norms and practices. So, going to the idea of surveillance, which is one of the first concepts that guide the politics of digital watching. You may be familiar with Michel Foucault, the French philosopher's idea of using the panopticon as a metaphor to understanding surveillance technology. So, panopticon, if you etymologically sort of look at the term, pan means all and optic means seeing. So panoptic would be that, I'm able to see all of it, what is in front of me. So the panopticon is actually derived from, so Michel Foucault derives or is inspired by the idea of the panopticon, which was originally proposed by Jeremy Bentham to propose a design of a prison. So it's a very carceral sort of a design. And this proposal comes from Bentham in 1791, whereby the design proposes a guard tower in the center of a wheel-shaped prison, and this, the wheel-shaped prison has cells that would point inward, and the central tower would house the guard at the top of the tower. And the cells would be occupied by the prison inmates. Now, the idea of the design is that the prisoners would always be under the idea that they are being watched by somebody in the guard central tower, although the prisoners would not be able to see if somebody is actually in the tower, watching them. But the idea of constantly being watched, or that they may be constantly being watched, this idea of panopticon comes from this carceral prison design originally proposed by Jeremy Bentham. And Foucault was heavily inspired by this model of surveillance. And so he sort of proposes this idea of, the panopticon in this social context. And Foucault proposes that this idea of the panopticon illustrates how disciplinary societies would eventually subjugate their citizens. And, which is the panopticon's goal is to make the prisoners conscious about them being watched all the time. So, now, if you sort of, translate this to our everyday life, for example, the very fact that we have CCTV cameras around us, is an idea that, somebody in a space that has a CCTV camera, has sort of acknowledged the fact that they are being watched, although we may not know if the cameras are working, if the cameras are switched off, and so on and so forth. But the very presence of having a CCTV camera in a space, in a physical space, is an idea of the concept of being observed. So if you sort of translate this idea of the panopticon, for example, to social media platforms, scholars have looked at how the idea of panopticon as applied to the internet empires or mega platforms, as we call them. For example, MNCs such as Google, for example, Facebook, for example, Twitter, for example, Amazon companies, for example, they have sort of, used in some way, they have included the concept of panopticon within their design, within their social media presence. And this sort of, in a way, produces a knowledge that is distinctly different than a knowledge, than the form of knowledge that is produced in a non-digital sort of a platform or non-digital society. So, for example, scholars such as Vaidyanathan has used the term Googleization, which has been used to describe the ways in which Google company has expanded its influence into many domains of social, economic, and political life. So, what happens then is that power is understood in digital public engagements not as an unidirectional sort of an occurrence, but in multidimensionality that is situated within network societies, and it has a characteristic that is often also voluntary in nature and has an impact on everyday lifestyle of people. So this also brings in the concept of the form of data and the idea of data being a socio-material artifact, a socio-material object. And scholars like Lash, they have argued that the newly digitized information economy produces its neo-commodities. And these neo-commodities are nothing but the data that is being produced. And these sort of, power negotiation that go on in newly digitized information economy is heavily sort of posited on the idea of on the panopticon and surveillance technologies. So, for example, if you think of, your social media profile, for example, or anyone has a social media profile, it has certain characteristic features. First, you have a like button, you have other emoticon buttons, you have a sharing option, you can have a comment option. So these are not just between the user of the profile to interact with the data that is that they have fed in on the social media profile, but these are also functions of surveillance and surveillance, and these sort of produce a knowledge structure that is heavily informed by this politics of digital watching. So coming back to the question of data as socio-material objects, we have seen that in the last decades or so, and continuing till date, sociologists and other theorists, social theorists, have argued that digital data are neither immaterial nor they are, minuscule components of any given society. So digital data are as much material, as much contextual to the societies in the platforms that they emerge from. And this perspective of looking at digital data as a social material approach is heavily drawing from the science and technology studies, which is a branch of interdisciplinary studies that emerge to look at the stance of media technologies in particular, and also on computerized technologies more specifically in the social sciences. So the idea of data being contextual, data being a social material object, is also helpful to understand through the lens of what Bruno Latour, sociologist of science, calls the actor network theory. And this actor network theory, as Latour would say, um, proposes a framework where there is a role of non-human actors and human actors, and they negotiate a sort of agency in their interactive process. So the actor network theory then directs attention to the materiality and the heterogeneous nature of human experience and subjectivity. That it is not just human actors who are commanding or negotiating agency in a particular context. There are non-human, agents. There are non-human actors who equally negotiate or interact with human actors and negotiate sort of a agency in the process. So the actor network theory is an insightful approach for us to understanding, these interactions in digital society and digital platforms, particularly in relation to understanding digital phenomena as networks, social media platforms, and data. So data then becomes a central point of discussion here, that it is not just a social material object, but it is also a product of assemblage. It is also a product of community engagement. It is also a product of public engagement. And the concept of assemblage here is drawn from a Deleuze-Guattarian idea of the rhizome. And the assemblage concept denotes the intermingling of human and non-human in a various dynamic ways. So it is sort of, drawing from Bruno Latour's idea of actor network theory, and borrowing from the Deleuze and Guattari's ideas. It is talking about data as an assemblage, as a collection, as a as a product where the public is involved, the collective is involved, the community is involved, and the idea of assemblage also provides a theoretical basis for us to understanding how non-human actors interact with each other. And this is sort of, speaking directly to another avenue of scholarship and practice, which you may be familiar with, called the Internet of Things. So the Internet of Things is a very, niche area in the computer science domain. And, Bruno Latour's idea and Deleuze's idea of the assemblage speaks directly to, what we mean by human, non-human sort of interaction and agency negotiation, particularly in the context of cases such as the Internet of Things. So, going back to the idea of, whether, somebody on a social media platform uses a like button or a share button, or, if you have your individual browsing histories recorded, if you have your personal comments shared on social media, and to the extent, hardware and software that structure your choices that are available to you, these, all together sort of speak to the idea of data as assembled, data as social material objects, and also to representing the digital phenomena as objects that serve the purpose of acknowledging their existence, particularly with reference to its effects on power. So power then, again borrowing from a very Foucauldian understanding of power, that power can be multidimensional, that power can be, voluntary, and then power can be activated when there is an, sort of a two-way interaction, is bringing in the concept of the idea of data fluidity. So the idea of data fluidity is speaking to the idea that, when we interact on social media platforms, the software that we are interacting with is not always at all static. And this idea of a non-static, software that is constantly responding to inputs from its users, constantly, producing network systems, updating its data, recognizing the location of the user's device, and noticing any other activities that is going on, and tagging, for example. These are all ideas that are speaking to the concept of data fluidity, that data is not static. So the idea of data fluidity, Lev Manovich, for example, gives us two very fundamental examples that we interact with possibly every day. He gives an example of, for example, Google Earth platform, Maps, Google Maps, for example. So what Manovich sort of says is that, due to the constant updating nature of Google Earth, that, multiple people are simultaneously sort of updating the data on Google Maps, on Google Earth. Each time a user would access Maps, user would access Google Earth, every time the user is actually looking at a new data point, a new data set, because this platform is constantly being sort of updated with new data sets. So every time that you are looking at Google Earth, you are looking at a new Earth. You're looking at a new Google Earth, and that is what Manovich sort of captures as an idea of data fluidity, using the example of Google Earth. Similarly, Manovich also gives the example of the Wikipedia. And I'm sure you must have used Wikipedia or looked at how Wikipedia functions. And what Manovich talks about is that Wikipedia entries are dynamic, and they are also, like Google Earth, they're also constantly updated, and they're also edited regularly. So when users access, Wikipedia data, every time there's a chance that they are looking at, a data that has been created very recently. And so this is what brings in the concept of, data fluidity. So what happens is, just to conclude, that our understanding and experience of information itself is changing. What we call data, what we call digital data, this is in a constant mode of updation, and this understanding and experiencing of that information is constantly changing. And here's a little quote I want to end with, quote by Manovich, where he talks about humans and software interacting in ways, and it is difficult to disentangle one from the other. This is what Manovich is saying, open quotes. What are interactive media data? Software code as it executes, the records of user interactions, for example, clicks and cursor movements, the video recording of a user's screen, a user's brain activity as captured by an EEG or fMRI. All of the above or something else, close quote. So this is what Manovich is questioning. At what point do we not regard something as data? And at what point do we accept that everything is data and data is fluid? And this also opens up new directions of examinations and understanding of what then is digital data. And this is something I will take up in the next part of this module, where I will be talking about digital data and how digital data is sort of expressed on platforms such as digital archives. Thank you.